All right. So I am Richard Yanez, and I'm very happy to be here with my dear friend, mi compañera, Michelle Otero, on the wonderful occasion of her new book. You should hold up your book, Michelle. This is her creation, Malinche's Daughter, and it is a new chapbook, the latest chapbook by Momotombo Press here at the University of Notre Dame. And Michelle, you and I go back 3 years at least, if not longer in some cosmic sense. But I thought it would be wonderful to get on record a couple of personal things, and then we'll move more into professional concerns, and then of course we can get into some political type issues that do arise in your work as well as in your life. Why don't we start off with, there's such an important question that comes from the border space that you and I are from, about where are you from? How would you answer that? Where do you call home?
I think if you had asked me the question before I ever lived in Oaxaca, I would say I'm from New Mexico, because that felt like home, and it was the place where I had lived the longest. I grew up, I was born in Los Angeles actually, but my people are from are from the border. They're from southern New Mexico. So when I was 2, my parents moved back home, back to Deming, and that's where I grew up. That's where I went to high school. That's where the place that I escaped from when I went to college. But it's the place that I've always gone back to. But now that I have this experience of living and working in southern Mexico and being in Oaxaca, I really feel like home is, it's bigger than that. I mean, home is the border region, but it's also, well, I have a group of friends who say, every time I come back to the States, they say, oh, well, you're going to your País del Norte. So you have 2 countries now. And that's how I feel like I have a country, or not even so much a country, because I think I identify a lot more with being from southern New Mexico and being a southern New Mexican and a fronteriza than I do with being a citizen of the U.S. And then my other home and my other identity is very much tied up with being in Oaxaca and living and working in southern Mexico.
Well, before we get to your current life in Oaxaca, which I'm very curious to hear about, and I think is very important, and especially when we think of Malinche's Daughter. Let's not leave southern New Mexico a little bit too quickly. I think that when you say that it's the space of your people, could you tell us a little bit about your family in terms of who you consider familia, even negotiating that space between your hometown of Deming, New Mexico, and my hometown of El Paso, and this idea of the fronteriza? Maybe that would be worth sort of documenting at this time.
Yeah, it's funny because when people ask me where I'm from in Oaxaca, I say, I'm from the States, or I'm from New Mexico, and then they say, but you have Mexican blood, don't you? And I say, yes. Well, which of your parents was born in Mexico? And I say, neither one. And where were they born? They were born in New Mexico. How about your grandparents? They were born in New Mexico too, and my great-grandparents. And so I always say that I want to develop this pamphlet that kind of gives a history of Chicanos living in the Southwest and living along the border. And so the people I consider kind of my familia and my familia, both in a cultural sense and in a genetic sense, are the people who live along that U.S.-Mexico border, that stretch where you and I are both from southern New Mexico, stretching through El Paso. And I was every time I try to explain it to somebody who's not from there, I just say, you just have to go and see what it's like, because it's 3 countries and 3 different states. But to me, it all feels like one entity, like one space in and of itself, and each space has its own nuances. But something about that space, each point in that space is very similar, like the language, the words we occupy, the code switching, the food. I mean, even things like, like the music and the way that we end up writing and the way that we end up telling our stories. There's something about, even though you and I grew up in different towns, like there's something about the way that we've experienced the universe. I think that's very similar and very much shaped by being in that little tiny stretch of border. But that isn't really so tiny.
That's true. Yes, there's almost 2 million people in that space. No, I like the way you talk about landscape, and when I was reading your work, I definitely felt a kinship, not necessarily to specifically how I write or what I write, but definitely too the many writers along the border, and of course in El Paso and Juarez we have so many, and we can maybe mention some of those later. But I do think that there is this. You use the word sort of universal relationship. Well, let's go ahead and because one of the things that I mentioned in my introduction to your book is this idea of distance, and you mentioned earlier that you're currently now living in Oaxaca. Before we go there, however, let's fill in the dots between let's just say leaving Deming as a young woman, and then how your journey has taken you to many different spots in North America.
Yeah. It was funny when a friend of mine read my bio and he said, "You've had like 4 different lives," and that's how I feel. So when I left Deming at the age of 18 after graduating from Deming High School, I went to Harvard, and that was like a whole other universe. And actually being in this space, being in a place, you know, like Notre Dame, which is a lot like a lot like Harvard feels. You know, it feels kind of that same thing, like just stepping into another world, in a world of a lot of privilege, where you don't see many people who grew up along the border, and it's kind of like crossing another border. You know, like crossing. It's kind of like crossing into the north, like coming to a space like Notre Dame. So I spent 4 years at Harvard and studied U.S. history, and then after that. I lived in Belize for 2 years, and I was a Jesuit volunteer. So being a Jesuit volunteer is a little bit like being a Peace Corps volunteer, but it's much more like it's much heavier on the Peace Corps side than on the Catholic side, which is where the Jesuit comes in. So what made it a Catholic program was that I lived in community with other volunteers, and I had a very church-type job. So my first year I trained lay people to help out in parishes around the country. And my second year, I was the pastoral assistant at a Catholic church, which had a primary school attached to it. So I did everything but say Mass.
Right.
I played guitar, I led the children's choir, I was the volleyball coach, I taught religion, I organized the parish fair, everything. So those were those 2 years.
Okay.
And then after that, I decided to go home, which at the time for me was New Mexico. And I went to the middle of the state. I went to Albuquerque. I lived in Albuquerque for 5 years, and that's when I got really interested in figuring out how to create a life where I wouldn't have to fit in a 9-to-5 kind of job, and really learning to embrace that the structures that I've been looking for and the structures in which I feel most comfortable don't really exist. And so throughout my life, I've had to create them. So that's when I started to do that work-wise in Albuquerque. So I had some contractual positions with nonprofit organizations, things ranging from teen pregnancy to land use to drug addiction. And then through those different contracts, I built up a consulting business. And so I did strategic planning and training on volunteer recruitment and media work. And then I just realized there was something creative that was still calling me. And so I left Albuquerque, and I just decided it's time to go to the border. And I moved to El Paso, and I started taking music classes, of all things. And so I was taking voice classes, and through those voice classes and through being at the University of Texas, El Paso, I met a bunch of writers. And that's when I realized there's only one thing that I do every day without complaining, and that's writing.
Right.
Like now I do it every day and I complain a little bit because it's different. But and yeah, so through that I started taking creative writing courses in El Paso, and then somebody that I was dating at the time said, "Why don't we apply for Fulbrights, and why don't you do creative writing workshops for women survivors of sexual assault in Mexico?" And it just kind of fell into my lap like that. I mean, the work was putting the project together,
Right.
and making the context and doing the work that I needed to do. But it was really just throughout every single one of those places, Harvard, Belize, Albuquerque, El Paso, and now Oaxaca. Like, I've just been really fortunate to meet people who have kind of planted those seeds,
Right,
and have
right.
helped me. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to sort of phrase that. And although this part of your work that's in Malinche's Daughter doesn't necessarily chronicle or document each of those. I do think it's evident in there not only in the autobiographical sense, but more so in the wonderful portrayal of the history, because when we think about distance, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only physical, it's also temporal and also emotional. So I'm curious that of all these different spaces you've mentioned, and I just learned now that you're born in Los Angeles, so we can go there, but is there any one, and it could be possibly Oaxaca, since this is where you're currently living, but which one of those spaces right now has most, do you think, shaped you as the writer activist you are now?
I would say Oaxaca. If for no other reason than that, it's the first place where I've really stepped into and embraced the dualities of being a Chicana, or have embraced all of the contradictions in my life. And even when I wrote the proposal, I remember writing a paragraph that said, like, I wanted a way to reconcile the differences of being a feminist who was raised Catholic, or of being a Chicana, which is a contradiction in and of itself,
right,
or being an academic and a spiritual person, or being an activist and an academic. And what I'm realizing now is that I don't have to. What I've realized in Oaxaca is that that's part of the experience of being a person who was raised along the border and being a Chicana. It's having these contradictions and letting them all kind of live inside me. And they don't have to get along nicely all the time either. I don't necessarily have to reconcile them. I just need to recognize this is a part of me and that is a part of me too, instead of choosing. And even in the way that my life has been, and in the way that I'm living right now, coming back to my país del norte and going to my país del sur. So I'm not living in the States permanently. And by living in Oaxaca, I'm not renouncing living in the States. I feel like I kind of live in both places. Right.
Right. Well, I'm curious. I'm wondering if Oaxaca is this blessed space now, and this point where you can, as you say, sort of inhabit these different sort of energies, these different impulses, if you will, creatively at least. And is it something about the landscape in Oaxaca? Is it something about the people who are both celebrated and in some ways looked at in sort of a critical way in Malinche's daughter? Or is it more that you think that you're just more mature now? You've just sort of worked through some personal experiences. Maybe, what is it Oaxaca, or is it this place in time? I guess.
I think it's Michelle Otero at this point in my life being in Oaxaca. I think there was something very magical about my arriving in Oaxaca at the point of time when I did. It was less than a year after my grandmother died, and she's a fronteriza. She was born in Hanover, New Mexico, and but grew up in Deming, and that's where she met my grandpa, and that's where they lived together for 60 years and raised their family. And so when she died, it was kind of losing this this focal point of the family, like really the heart of the family. So in some ways, in figuring out, negotiating our space within the family without having this very strong figure with us in a physical sense. And she had a really strong physical presence.
Right.
And so I think I arrived in Oaxaca with that white space kind of in my life, and being in that landscape is very much like being in the landscape of southern New Mexico. So you've got kind of like the high desert and the mountains and kind of the stark beauty and the big sky. And so just geographically it reminded me a lot of home. But I was able to have kind of like the emotional and the physical distance from home, and able to create in this space where I was distant from a lot of the memories I was writing about, like physically distant from the memories. And so it was almost like being physically distant from my own memories enabled me to be more present to my students, and also to be able to like bring all of those things together, my student stories and my own story together on the page. So I think it was a combination of the landscape of Oaxaca, my students' openness to sharing their stories with me, and my own openness to receiving them.
And I think that's also some of the kinship that I think that your work and you yourself, both as a friend of mine, but also as a writer, that keeps us surviving this sort of migrant life that I call it. And I do want to talk about this new community and family in Oaxaca, but I think it's only fair that we talk about your family, your parents who I have met. I did not meet your grandmother, but I knew you at the time that you were experiencing her passing. So I'm curious how your family, I know that tomorrow you go back to El Paso with your book and with a very tangible, with tangible evidence, is what I'm going to call it, for lack of better words, of the work that you've done, maybe all your life in some way. That, I'm curious how your family thinks of your choices to live, work, write away from your birthplace, away from your ancestral space. How have they been negotiating the last few years since you've been, especially when you haven't been in the States?
Yeah, I think we've kind of grown in that together. I was going to say that they've changed, but I think I've also changed in the way that I present it, that I present my choices to them. So, for example, we can go all the way back to high school. I mean, to my senior year of high school, and I already knew that I didn't want to go to school in the Southwest. I wanted to go far away, and I was really attracted to the East Coast. So when I was filling out my applications, my dad said, well, why don't you just stay close to home and get your basics, and then you can go to one of those places far away. And I was like, no. No, I don't want to do that. So after that, he kind of backed off. And then by the time the letter came from Harvard, my mom said, if you want to go, we'll find a way to get you there, which they did, and we did. I mean, it was definitely a family effort. So I think even though they haven't always understood my choices, they've always been appreciative during those times that I have gone back to New Mexico or been along the border. They've tried to be supportive. And I think my parents visited me in Oaxaca, and I think for them, it was such a gift for me, and I think it was a gift for them to see that I'm really at home there. That I have a community, that even though I'm far from my biological family, I definitely have Familia in Oaxaca. I have a whole community of compañeras who take care of me and watch out for me, and we take care of each other. So I think it was the first time they really got that, and I didn't have to explain it. It was just, they just got to see my life in action in Oaxaca, and so since then they've been a lot more, my parents especially have been a lot more understanding about just my choice to be where I need to be and where I'm going to thrive, whether that's right next to them in Deming or really far away from them
right.
in Oaxaca.
And as a woman, as a younger woman, do you think your family's expectations, maybe your parents, but even maybe siblings or extended family, were their expectations differently for you? Not necessarily only in the gender role type of way, but definitely as one of the younger representatives of your family.
Yeah, I think that my mom would always say, because I have 3 older brothers, and there's a 6-year gap between the brother who's closest in age to me, the older brother who's closest in age to me, and me. And then there's a 10-year gap between my little brother and me. So I think he and I were both surprises, although no one tells us that. So my mom would always say things like, I don't know that if it's so much that the expectations were different. I think their worries were different about what could happen to us when we left the house. So anytime my parents dropped me off at any kind of function, I hesitate to use the word geek, but I was really kind of nerdy in high school. So I was had this very controlled existence by my own design. My parents were strict, but I also needed and wanted that strictness and that structure. So when my mom would drop me off somewhere, like to go to a band competition, she'd say, you know, now don't be going off alone with anyone and don't leave the group and this and that. And I know it wasn't until much later in high school that that really started to bother me. And I said, well, what do you think I'm going to do?
Right.
And I knew that my brothers didn't get the same warning. So I don't know if it was expectations. That there's always been this strange kind of contradiction where, and my mom will say it now, that she has always trusted my choices more than she's trusted my brother's choices. Like she's always said that I was more mature at certain ages than any of my brothers were. But the flip side of that was also like she worried about me a lot more than she worried about my brothers. And I think still does in some ways. So so it's just, it's interesting. I don't even know whether to call it good or bad. It's just interesting to kind of sit back and be like, like where does that come from? And I'm sure, like, at least on my mother's part, it comes from a place of wanting to protect me and wanting me to be happy and healthy, and her own process and my father's own process of redefining what happy and healthy means. And so maybe it doesn't mean getting married and having children. Maybe it means living in Oaxaca and writing.
Right. Well, that's so refreshing to hear as someone from a Mexican-American sort of background. It is sort of inhabiting that duality that you were talking about earlier, and even more so for the women in our culture. I'm glad to see, and I've seen it, and I can't wait to celebrate your book back in the border space. Let's transition a little bit into more of a professional conversation or a dialogue about your other, you talked about El País del Norte, and when you come to the United States, one of the reasons that it keeps bringing you back, and maybe, I'm not sure what's going to happen after you're done with the program in Vermont, if you will have a mostly south of the border existence. But sort of explain to us a little bit about this MFA program that you're in now in Vermont, and specifically I'm curious about the writing community, if any, there in Vermont, as well as any lessons that you think have come from your time as part of a low residency MFA program.
I'm really glad I chose a low residency program, and I didn't even know they existed when I was shopping around for programs. So I kept thinking, you know, a lot of people talked about going to like kind of like the Harvard of MFA programs, and there are a few, and I just thought, I did that already. Like, I have the Harvard degree. Like, I don't need it as a writer. I just need to be in a place where I can write well, number one, and where the focus is on writing. And so I was worried of applying to programs because I thought, I know no matter what program I go into, no matter which program I choose, I'm going to be one of the few people of color there. And so what responsibility do I feel as a woman of color to create a space for us within the context of a larger institution? And I remember feeling just a combination of things, tired of having to be a representative and having to be a cultural interpreter, feeling guilty because I felt tired, and also feeling a little bit selfish and just wanting to find a place where I could write, where the emphasis was on writing and where I could talk about craft and not whether or not I italicized my Spanish words, even though that just the choice to do that is a political statement in some ways, and writers have their own choices about that. So when I found out about low resident programs from a friend of mine, I was looking around, and I chose Vermont because I talked with some students who had gone there. They weren't people of color, but they really liked the program. And I think I was fortunate to arrive at a time, I think our class was kind of an experiment. There were 6 people of color in the class, in the incoming class.
Anybody worth mentioning?
They will be, actually. I don't think a lot of their work is out there, but Karen Taylor is a wonderful African-American writer from New York who's got a great collection called Backdoors and Glass Ceilings, Riffs on Race.
Great.
It's great. She's
Karen
great,
Taylor.
and she's Karen Taylor, and then Stephanie McBride wrote an amazing story that I hope to see in print. She read it at her graduate reading. it's called The Hairless Wonder, and it starts off about a woman well, she's hairless, she has no body hair, and she's beautiful and sexy, but what Stephanie does through telling this woman's story is she touches on race relations in the US, on Emmett Till, on lynching, on violence. It's one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. Harrison Candelaria Fletcher is another creative nonfiction writer. His mother's this great Chicana artist in Albuquerque, and he's writing a beautiful story. He's got one story that traces the arroyos running throughout Albuquerque. So they're, like, if the world doesn't know them yet, then they should, and they will. But we all, and then Neil Callender, who's a wonderful poet out of Boston. But we all kind of came in at the same time, and so we were really able to kind of talk about what it was like to be one of a handful of people of color in a mostly white institution. And fortunately, the nice thing about low resident programs, and the reason I chose one, is instead of being on the campus all the time, you're only on campus the first 10 days of each semester for a residency. And it's a really intense 10 days because they pack a semester's worth of readings and lectures and workshops into 10 days. But the payoff for that is being able to set up your own study plan and knowing that the university trusts you to come up with what you need to learn, with guidance from your mentor, of course, but I haven't had anybody say, like, you have to read this book, or hand me a reading list, or say, like, these are the things you need to write this semester. So each semester I've been able to sit down with my mentor and negotiate my semester plan. So what I've discovered this semester is, like, all of these kind of hybrid forms, like, speaking of duality, like lyric essays, prose poems, shorts, and really feeling like I've finally found the language and the structure and the form to help me interpret what it's like to be a Chicana who grew up along the border. And so just knowing that I don't have to, at least at this stage in the game, at least in the writing stage of the game, I don't have to say I'm writing prose, or I'm writing poetry, or I'm writing a memoir, I'm writing this or that. I'm really, instead of avoiding going into that in-between space, I'm just jumping right into it and figuring out how to write duality.
And that's a great thing to hear as a writer of color and as someone who talks to a lot of other young writers, MFA programs. The result is never really that positive. But before I ask you what advice you might have for would-be MFAers, I'm curious because the book, as you say, about your own work and hybridity and about this mestizaje, if you will, in text, exist in Malinche's Daughter. Was Malinche's Daughter created during your time in that program, or how much of the book would you say, in the way it exists now, was completed before entering Vermont, during Vermont? And I believe you're finishing in May, is that correct? You're
in July.
In July. So
yeah.
I guess, in looking back at the last, let's say 3 years, I know you took a year off for the Fulbright to complete your low residency. Have you seen your voice and your vision of this particular project develop with the help of Vermont or in spite of?
No, I think definitely with the help, and it has a lot to do with number one, taking a year off and being in Oaxaca during that year, and just having a year to continue writing and to develop my voice as a writer without having the structure of a program, which I think actually helped me to be not a better student, but more importantly, like a better, more disciplined writer. So if I'm not in school and I don't have a mentor waiting for my packet, am I still going to write? And the answer is yes, and that's a good answer. And then I'll say because of Vermont, because of my mentor third semester, who Sue Silverman, and she's one of the women who blurbed the book. But this Malinche's Daughter, and shaping this book and writing it was my third semester project. And I joke with a lot of people that I kind of had my fourth semester, third semester. So a lot of students spend their fourth semester revising, polishing, shaping a manuscript, and that's how I spent my third semester. And Sue was really wonderful I remember writing her a letter and saying, So I'm trying to write the stories of these women, and I've got a section about my own life, but I don't know how much of that should go in there, so I don't want to take over the story. What do you think? And so she writes back, and it was a very funny response, because even before I got the letter, I was like, I already know what she's going to say. And I just remember her writing, there is no story without your story. Like, you have to tell your story. That was one thing she said. And then the other thing she said was the individual story is the universal story. And so I think my first year in Vermont, I spent a lot of time, and even prior to Vermont, I spent a lot of time trying to tell this universal story. And even early drafts of Malinche's daughter, like I had references to the Vietnam War and to Jefferson's relationship with one of his slaves, and just in everything. And I was trying to bring in the whole history of violence against women. And Sue just said, just go small. Like Anne Lamott says, just find those 1-inch picture frames and go for the details, tell the individual story, and in that individual story, you'll tell the universal story. And I was so thankful for that, because I think I needed permission on some level, or at least just somebody to tell me it was okay to write a whole book about myself,
Right.
and to write a book about the experiences of my students, but using myself as a reference, and to be very overt about that. So I think, in an answer to the first part of your question, really very little of this book was written before Vermont. So the second essay, Moving Pictures, in another incarnation, was actually my grad school application piece. So it's the piece that connected me to Vermont and got me into Vermont. But everything else in the book was written once I was a Vermont college student.
Well, that's also, again, very positive, and I'm glad you mentioned Sue Silverman, who does blurb the book, and I had a chance to meet her at the recent AWP conference, because I think that this idea of there is no story without your story is definitely prevalent in the book, whereas even in the larger incarnation that I read that became this book in front of us, you are, and I imagine there's a question here somewhere, but it's mostly a compliment. I know we've had lots of conversations, but I'm just so proud of the book itself. I mean, I have strong feelings for yourself as a Chicana, as a woman, and as a friend, but I think the work itself, because now the book will enter the world of the public world, and it does a wonderful job of doing this idea of being universal, but not getting lost in the big wild world of the memoir, for example, and we can talk about that in a second. But I think the question before we leave Vermont to go on to some other things is, what would you recommend to other writers of color, other Chicanitas, Chicanitos who are considering MFA programs? I mean, would you encourage them to do what maybe happened either by accident or intent with your relationship with Sue? Would you encourage them to go away from home? What kinds of advice would you give to writers?
I don't know that there's a universal answer to that. I would just ask people, one really helpful thing that somebody did for me is that he loaned me, he loaned me like his guide to AWP approved schools.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very beginning of that guide, there's a questionnaire that just, so you sit down and you ask yourself, like, what do I want out of this? And what am I willing to put up with? And what do I absolutely need? And it's almost like going into a relationship. And not everybody needs the same thing in a relationship, but it's really important to know what you need, like as a writer and as a human being, if you're going into a program, because it is a relationship that you develop with an institution and with your teachers. And so I would say, like, if being close to home and close to your family is something that's important to you, then you need to do that. I know that being away from home and being away from my family has been important for me in terms of my writing, especially because of what I'm writing about. So because I write about violence against women, because I write about sexual abuse, I know that being close to my family, especially sharing a physical space with my family would have been really difficult at the time that I was writing the book. So I guess I would encourage writers to think about like what it is they need, what it is that frightens them, how they can work through that fear, and how a particular program can help them face that fear. I mean, I think all of us are afraid of leaving home in some ways. I know for me it's one of the smartest things that I've done, and it's helped me. I wouldn't have the voice that I have if I hadn't left home. And also being open to redefining what home is. Like it's, in some senses it's a physical space, but it's also a place that we carry inside of us. And in some ways we enable that space to grow larger when we leave the physical home.
Well, that is great. That is great advice for all would-be writing students. Well, we're here in South Bend, Indiana, a place that I imagine you and I did not think a lot about when we were growing up. It was probably more along the lines of Lordsburg or even El Paso. It was, but here we are together, and we're here with a couple of our compañeros, with Paul Martinez and with Brenda Cardenas, as well as Francisco Aragon and Maria Melendez, to celebrate the publishing of your book. I mean, the other books have been out for a few years, but you just saw this yesterday.
Yes.
Is that right?
I just saw this yesterday.
So I want to know just
I
want to know just the very raw things. I know that we walked over here, and I can feel the karma and the emotions and sort of this aura about you. But could you share with me your thoughts and then your emotions about having your first book publication? And I'm even curious about who you've called, who you've emailed. Even maybe mention some people in the acknowledgements that you want to talk about.
Yeah, I was in Oaxaca when Malinche and I received so today's Thursday, so I spent the whole day yesterday traveling, knowing like when I get there, I hope Francisco has a copy of the book in his car when he picks me up at the airport. But on Tuesday, I got an email from him, and in the subject line it says, "Malinche's daughter has landed." And I don't know, I'm really blown away by, and I'm so grateful to I don't even know who to begin thanking. I mean, I guess the dedication is to, we'll start with the dedication because that's
a good
concrete.
Place to start. No, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, so para las creativas, alquimistas todas, and that says Las Creativas is the name that I did 6 different workshop groups, one particularly for sexual assault survivors, and then one group that was open. Of those 6 groups, there was one set aside for sexual assault survivors, and then the other 5 were open to any woman who wanted to heal her wounds through writing. And so each group kind of had its theme, but there was one group that over the course of time really became my group, and we still meet as a group, and now I'm more of a member of that group than I am the teacher. I still facilitate sometimes, but we share those duties, and I co-facilitated groups with some of those women. But at one point, one of the women said, "Somos las creativas." That's our name. We're the creativas. We're the creative women. And I just thought, that's great. This book is for them. Like they're all creativas. So that's where that came from. And I put alquimistas todas because I like this thought of the alchemy of writing about our pain, of like through that. I've seen my students become alchemists, really, of being able to spin in the good sense, almost like spin or weave, being able to weave their pain into stories and into art and into a thing of beauty, like taking an ugly experience, whether it's sexual assault or the loss of someone close to them or an accident or any kind of loss, and being able to transform it into a very individual and very universal story. Being able to transform it into art has been such a privilege for me. As a woman and a writer and as a teacher, just as a human being, I think I'm in awe right now. I'm just in awe of how good my life is. And that's the biggest thing. And y para China, I think somebody will read this. I didn't even think about this. I'm sure people will read it and say, why is she thinking China? Right. But China's my grandmother. And And I know this will sound crazy, and in a way it kind of is, but right before I left for Oaxaca, I had lunch with a friend of mine who is my adivina friend. She's a psychic, and I feel like some people have a direct line. Like they can really just pick up a phone and be like, hey, it's so-and-so. And they have a direct line to the heavens and the universe and receive information that a lot of us aren't getting, and we need those people to help keep us on our path. And so this friend, Mary Virginia, who's also in the Acknowledgements, just looked at me. I'm biting into my sandwich, and she said, you don't have to worry. You're not going to be alone in Oaxaca. And I was like, okay. Like, wait. And I was worried. It was actually exactly what was on my mind at that point. And she said, somebody is going to be with you the whole time, watching over you, taking care of you, letting you know when you need to take better care of yourself, keeping you on your path. Do you know who that is? And I said, is that my grandma? And she said, yes. And then she pulled out the empty chair at our table, and she was like, she's right there. She hasn't left your side the whole time. And I really felt that while I was in Oaxaca. And I still feel it, just a lot of times where it was almost like I could hear her voice as I was writing, and sometimes I felt like, I don't know what it was, just her presence or sense that she was with me in the room, especially, and that all kind of solidified on Day of the Dead. I think being able to be in Oaxaca for Dia de los Muertos, and not the touristy commercial Dia de los Muertos, but the very simple, sincere, pure expression of just communing with the dead and opening up that pathway between this lifetime and the other side. It was really special to me because it helped me to see death in another way. So it's not that Gina is, physically she's not here anymore, but she's everywhere. You know, she's still definitely here, and I wrote no hay palabras, really there are no words, and I kept trying to write words like thank you for this or thank you for that, but there are no words to describe how thankful I am to her for her life, and really feeling like there's this new understanding that she and I have now that she is no longer walking the earth the way that she used to. I feel like I am able to accept her life and the choices that she made, and to embrace those, and to see myself as part of that continuum, and I think she's able to do that for me. It's like we can finally say to each other, you know, está bien, okay, and to hug each other. Yeah, and in terms of, I don't know, I feel like my acknowledgements are so long.
I know, and I know you kept revising them you revised them probably as much as you revised the manuscript. But you know, we can, you know, you talked about your blood family, and you called earlier the las mujeres in particular, but also I know there's been children also in Oaxaca, and some of them are documented in the book. But how, I realize that the book, which is primarily written in English, will not necessarily be embraced or sort of taken in the same way in Mexico as it will be, let's say, here in the U.S. But how do you think the women in particular of these various groups of survivors that you work with will receive and think about the way that their stories have become part of your story?
In the conversations that I've had with them, or this is kind of a cute aside, but one of my, Lucia in the story just said, well, what's my name? Like, what name did you give me in the book? And so she was very excited. And when I asked her for permission to use her story and for permission to talk about, I explained to her a few things. I mean, it's my story that I'm telling in this book, but part of my telling that story is in talking about what I've learned through my interactions with you and with some of the other women who appear in this book. And I told her that, and I just said the book is about healing, and I think your story can help other women heal. And so in all of my conversations, that's the intention with which I wrote the book, and that's the intention with which I asked for permission to write people's stories and to talk about my interactions with them. And in that, I was so nervous going into those conversations, and completely grateful and relieved coming out of each of them, because the women were so gracious. And I think in the acknowledgements I put it, thank you for sharing your lives and your stories. And people have asked me, wow, that work you do is really hard. You know, how do you do that? And there's a part of it that is difficult, like accompanying someone and sitting with someone through their pain and watching them go through this painful process of acknowledging a sexual assault or a buried memory of having been abused as a child. But then there's also the real beauty of that, of having somebody recognize the power of their own voice and their right to tell their own story. And that's really the reward. That's what I come away with more than anything else. And I hope that's what comes across on the page. And a lot of the women, like Las Creativas, they were very honored about the dedication. And to me, it was just kind of a given. I was like, it's for Las Creativas and for my grandma. And so when I took them the proof and they saw the dedication and saw that it was in Spanish, they were thankful. I think there's a lot of mutual respect. I think that's the thing. So I think that even though some of them won't be able to read the book because it's in English, there's a lot of excitement about eventually translating it into Spanish, and I have a few students who do translations, and they would love to work with me on that, and I would love to work with them. But I think there's also a lot of excitement on their part about seeing our labor, like seeing that our collective work exists in a tangible form. You know, like, here it is.
I know. And let's talk about, well, there's a couple of things, and maybe we could segue, because, you know, this is the first time I've held it, and while I've seen the writing before, and a lot of emails have passed between you and I, crossing those virtual borders that many of us find ourselves faced with. I don't know if this is going to sound naive on my part, but it maybe because I too come from a family, both historical and personal, that is matriarchal in many ways. I beginning with my relationship with my own grandmother, with my relationship to Catholicism and La Virgen de Guadalupe. But let's talk about just in the last few moments that we have, and then I'm kind of curious if you would read something for us. So maybe you could be thinking about something. But I want to talk about the women and the significance of how this book is a celebration, is a exaltation, is a testimony of women. Everything, not only from the subject matter of the writing groups in Oaxaca, your spiritual advisors, but even Sue Silverman, who we mentioned before, and Norma Elia Cantu, and Ellen Bass, who provide the blurbs. And then, of course, the wonderful introduction written by Lisa Chavez,
Yes.
who has visited here at Notre Dame, and who I saw her read here, and who's a friend of ours. And then, of course, the namesake for the book, Malinche. But I know that's a large group, and you don't necessarily have to say the same about all of them. But I'm curious about, for yourself as a feminist, as a Chicana, as a writer activist, how special is it for you to be in this collective of women in print that's now going to have, as you said, a tangible space? What is that? Does that feel like a burden right now? Does it feel like a homecoming? Does it feel more like a part of the plan? I mean,
I think homecoming is the good word. No, it doesn't feel like a burden at all. It feels just, of all the writers who have loaned their name to the book, the only one I've never seen read is Ellen Bass. And I discovered Ellen Bass not as a poet, but as a survivor, as a sexual assault survivor, because of her book, The Courage to Heal. And anyone who knows that book and has used that book to heal knows that it's the Bible. It's the Bible for any survivor of childhood sexual abuse. It was only later that I discovered that she was a poet, and that made me love her and respect her even more. So the fact that her name is on here, just and Norma's name, after Norma writes about Laredo, and my grandpa was born in Laredo, Texas, and so that's a homecoming to another part of the border that I don't know. I do know it because it's in my blood, but I don't know it. I've never been there physically. I feel like I was able to write this book partly because Sue Silverman wrote her book. And then to have it all tied together by Lisa Chavez in her wonderful introduction is such an honor for me. And just the happy coincidence that she happens to live and teach now in Albuquerque, New Mexico, it makes sense. I guess it feels like, it's kind of like that inevitable surprise that we talk about, like in fiction. I feel like I'm stepping into the inevitable surprise of my life. I'm amazed by having this book in my hand and by seeing like the beautiful cover and the wonderful names that are part of it, and by knowing the places where I'll go and read both alone and in the company of the Women Writers Collective in El Paso. But I can kind of look back and see how so many choices I've made over the last few years, and so many choices that other writers, other Chicana writers, other women writers have made, have enabled me to be sitting here today, holding this book.
Well, that's very well said, and of course we have Tonantzin, La Virgen, gracing the cover. I think we're coming to the end of this time together, and I feel it would be wonderful if you would just read maybe a couple of pages for us to put a nice period at the end of this conversation.
Okay, let's see. Looking.
It's wonderful to see you hold the book.
I know,
too.
it's wonderful
it looks so
to
great.
hold it.
It is.
It feels so natural.
That's good. This seemed destiny, part of a big design.
Yes. Okay, I think I'll read from the title essay.
Okay.
And I'll read... Here we go. I'll read. This is toward the beginning of the title essay, which is in the very middle of the book. When I use the Spanish word sobreviviente, people think I work with survivors of accidents, natural disasters, and wars. You mean víctimas, they tell me. Oaxaca has no rape crisis center, no support groups for sexual assault survivors. People nod when I use the term agresión sexual. Some know victims and want to send them to my groups, but they wince when I say violación. It's what it sounds like, a violation. In English, we call it rape. Here I've learned to soften my vocabulary, suffer from violence, sexual aggression. I've opened the workshops to all women, knowing the survivors will be among them. I call the course Writing to Heal Our Wounds, a creativity workshop for women. Even the women, especially the women who seek me out, won't say violación. Nobody will say incesto. They don't seem to mind that I'm not a therapist. They don't correct me when I confuse the Spanish words for sunrise, amanecer, and threat, amenazar. I didn't grow up here. I don't know the men they see in nightmares. I help them write their stories. I write my own. I change their names and speak of our work in English. My last name is Otero. It's a Spanish name brought to the New World by conquistadores and friars. I'm tall in Oaxaca with wavy black hair and a long, thin face, my eyes the shades of a forest. People ask where I am from, where my people are from. I say, Nuevo Mexico, El Norte, but it doesn't make sense to them. I don't make sense to them. I have no stories of cousins or tios drowning in the Rio Grande or dying thirsty and disoriented in the Chihuahuan desert. The border crossed us, made us subjects, citizens of the working class, English-speaking spics, Mexican-American Chicanos. We wander inside ourselves looking for Tenochtitlan, our ancestral home, our Aslan, peering as Malinche must have when she stood at the volcano's ledge over the city on Lake Texcoco, feeling the draw of the water, knowing as they crossed the causeway that she must speak. No one can place my accent. It's called mestiza, Chicana, Born and raised in the U.S., English at home, Spanish in college, descendant of the oppressors and the oppressed, the conquistadores and the conquered. My razas, Adam and Eve, are an armed Spaniard and the Mixtec, Maya, Mexica, or any other pretty Indian girl transferred from her cacique's hands to the Spaniards. Cortés and his men collected Eva tras Eva as they marched toward Tenochtitlan. Maybe Adan found Eva hiding in the milpa, forced out when he set fire to the corn stalks. No, Malinche and her sisters had no place to hide, their tierra flattened by horses' hooves and marching men. Malinche's daughters did their best during the Mexican Revolution, cowering in dovecotes amongst the pigeons, or burrowing into the fecund earth, a reed connecting their mouths to breath and sky. They try to hide in Juarez's maquiladoras, or holding their mother's hands as they cross to El Norte. Rita hides behind her courtyard walls. My students, those who aren't ready, will hide in their jobs, their routines, their unwritten pages. I once hid under my bed in dreams of men leering through windows, wanting something from me they could neither buy nor steal. Here in Oaxaca, I sit high in this protected room with its private staircase and look over the terrace to the neighbors' rooftops. Nobody comes up here. I straddle north and south, Spanglish running across my body from one side of the border to the other, birthing a new text between women who know too well about conquest, survivor to survivor. I bridge the United States of Mexico and America with these words I type, these weavings of my stories and theirs, my fingers, our fabric. I interpret women's stories with my hands and soul the color of café con leche. I am Malinche's daughter. Mama, I find her in Oaxaca, on the page, staring back from my reflection in the copal smoke rising from my altar. She spoke Nahuatl and Mayan. She learned Spanish in Jesus, and now she is silent. She sends me women.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm just so looking forward to being a part of this journey with you, and I thank you for sharing your work with me and for this this amazing. It just seems sort of limiting to call it a book. It seems more of a, and I think in an email I called it a sacred act, and I reiterate that it is this sacred gift you've given to the rest of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.